Robb Stark stood at the prow of the ship as it cut through the greenish waters of Slaver's Bay, a warm wind fluttering the battered direwolf banner behind him. The sun was setting, spilling red and gold across the sky in colors that reminded him of a vanished northern autumn. Memories surged like tidal waves. He recalled the crisp, pine-scented air outside Winterfell's walls, the snow crunching underfoot, and the laughter of his siblings echoing in the courtyard. But this was Essos, where 1,000 new sights and scents assailed him, and far behind him on the deck, hundreds of grim-faced Northmen followed their young king, bound by blood and oath. It was a new chapter in his story, one that no one could have foreseen back when he was simply the eldest Stark son trying to protect his father's legacy. He could still see the faint outlines of the city they'd left behind, Meereen, and the towering pyramids that rose from the vast sprawl of mud brick houses. He had not lingered there for long, but long enough. Long enough to break chains, to rally followers who had grown disenchanted with the local powers, to broker tenuous alliances. That part of him which had once been a boy, naive to the monstrous complexities of the world, marveled that he now commanded sellswords and freedmen. But war had taught him harsh truths. He had lost so much. A father's wise counsel, a mother's unwavering presence, a kingdom's fealty. He'd almost lost himself. If it were not for those who believed in him, if it were not for his unwavering drive to see the Lannisters brought to justice, he might have faded like an unspoken promise. Instead, he was sailing deeper into Essos, to parley with unlikely allies, the Dothraki Khalasars, whose savage might be turned not just against Slaver's Bay, but eventually against the Iron Throne that had done him such grievous harm. In this new world, he was no longer the young wolf in name alone. He had proven his mettle on foreign sands, at the fringes of their great desert, where others would have flinched from the ferocity of the Dothraki. Robb stood firm. He had learned their language in bits and pieces, enough to greet them in shrill vowels and hard consonants that nearly caught in his throat. And he learned, to his surprise, that the Dothraki were not so different from the Northmen he had once commanded. They valued strength, honor, courage before fear. They did not kneel easily, but they respected a warrior who fought for his own. It was that respect he hoped to foster in the coming days, as he sailed to the rendezvous where Khal Ortho awaited with 3,000 riders. Robb turned, glancing at the men who traveled with him. Grey Wind was gone, lost in a cruel twist of fate, but he liked to imagine the direwolf spirit guiding him still. The men around him were a mixture of old faces and new-eyed Dewey. There was Lord Edwin Tallheart, a leathery man who had accompanied Robb after the disastrous events in the Red Wedding's aftermath. There were the Bolton deserters, ragged, haunted men who had fled their lord after learning of his betrayal. And there were newcomers, freed from the fighting pits and found in the desert caravans, men whose names he barely knew but who had pledged to follow him if it meant freedom or even a chance at spoils. Their motley shapes stood in clusters on the deck, some tall and broad, some short and wiry, many scarred by the lash or by distant battles. Their expressions showed weariness, hope, or suspicion. Up at the tiller, a hired Volantene pilot steered them through the changing currents. The wind whipped strands of Robb's auburn hair into his eyes, and he squinted toward the horizon. Another day, maybe two, and they would meet Khal Ortho and his outriders, forging a pact that could determine the fate of Westeros. It was a moment so momentous, it nearly stole his breath. If someone had told him a year ago that he would ride in the grass seas of the Dothraki, forging alliances with men who took pride in burning cities, he would have called them mad. But the dance of power and revenge had led him across the narrow sea, and he had changed. The illusions of chivalry had been stripped away. Now he was a man with a cause, his family's cause, but also something bigger. He wanted to set right the wrongs inflicted upon the North, and he would do so by any means necessary. That night, on the deck, he stared up at the stars, feeling the subtle rocking of the ship, half lulled by the hush of waves against the hull. A lone gull screeched overhead. Some of the men huddled around small braziers, warming their hands and muttering about their future. He could pick out a handful of Northmen by their accent, complaining about Essos's heat, even though it was far cooler on the water than it had been in the desert. Others had lived here long enough to claim a certain familiarity, but even they seemed uneasy about allying with the Dothraki. The Horse Lords were known to despise seafaring. To them, the ocean was poison water best left alone. Earning their friendship, or at least their loyalty, would not be simple. Robb leaned against the ship's rail and remembered his mother's voice. When he closed his eyes, he could see her face clearly, the sorrow etched into it at the twins. It was a memory he tried not to dwell upon, but he clung to her words of caution. To be bold but never reckless, to be smart but also swift in his decisions. Something within him wanted to do right by her, even if she was gone. He would not stand by and let the Lannisters keep the Iron Throne. Let House Bolton rule the North with cruelty and betrayal. Let House Frey remain unpunished. No. He would gather the might of Essos behind him, and he would return to his homeland as a king truly fit to reclaim what was stolen. Morning brought the clang of ropes and the creak of sails as they neared the designated coastline. In the dawnlight, a vast stretch of beach lay before them, beyond which the rolling fields of the Dothraki Sea shimmered. Robb's heart pounded a little harder. He ordered the men to prepare the skiffs, to pack what arms and provisions they could carry. The rest they would leave behind under a loyal commander who would guard the ships. No sense in spooking the Dothraki with a fleet they might misinterpret. He had learned enough. The Dothraki negotiated best on open ground, under the watchful skies, where they could see every threat and every friend approach. They disembarked in a controlled fashion, Robb leading the first small group. Leather boots sank into the wet sand, shells crunching beneath each step. The air felt different on land, heavier, warmer, carrying the sweet tang of grass and horse dung that drifted from the plains beyond. When they pushed beyond the dunes, they finally saw them, riders in the distance, little more than dark dots at first, swiftly growing in size as hooves thundered across the tall grasses. The men behind Robb tensed, forming up in a defensive stance, shields at the ready. But Robb raised a hand, signaling them to hold. This was meant to be a meeting of allies, if everything went well. Khal Ortha's outriders, some 50 strong, surrounded them in a loose circle. Their braids were heavy and long, signifying many victories, and they wielded curved arcs that glinted in the bright morning sun. Robb forced himself to stand tall, to appear confident. A single mistake here could mean slaughter. They spoke in quick bursts of Dothraki, scanning Robb's company with dark, shrewd eyes. Robb answered in his halting Dothraki tongue, urging calm, explaining he had come for a parley with Khal Ortha. The outriders exchanged glances, uncertain. One among them, a man with a gold bell tied into his braid, barked something harsh, presumably questioning the sense of parleying with a foreign king. Robb set his jaw and replied as best he could. Then, after a brief argument among themselves, the outriders parted, leaving a path between their ranks. Another horseman approached at a brisk gallop, reining in before Robb. Khal Ortha was younger than Robb expected. He had the lean, sinuous build of a Dothraki rider, with proud features and a confident tilt to his head. His braid was thick with bells that jingled with every twitch of his horse's movement. He regarded Robb with a piercing stare, as if measuring a man's worth by posture alone. Then he spoke, voice carrying the weight of a warlord. Robb nodded and answered, switching between the rough Dothraki he had learned and the common tongue that many mercenaries in Essos understood. His own men were silent, uncertain. For a tense moment, no one knew if blood would be spilled. Then Khal Ortha grinned, baring teeth. With a few brisk words, he welcomed the king in the north. Robb exhaled in relief, allowing himself a small smile of his own. They were invited to ride with the Khalasar, to share meat and salt in the Dothraki tradition. Robb knew this was no small courtesy. To break bread, or in this case dried horse meat, was to be offered guest right. At least for a time, they would be safe in the Khal's camp. It was the kind of recognition he needed. The camp itself lay a half-league inland, where the grasses swayed high enough to brush a man's waist as he walked. Thousands of tents formed a sprawling settlement of hide and cloth, horses milling about in makeshift corrals, children running barefoot, laughing. The sense overwhelmed. Sweat, animals, cooking fires, and the strong musk of so many people living so close. Robb and his men followed behind Khal Ortha's personal guard, casting uneasy glances at the throngs of men, women, and children who paused to watch the newcomers. Some wore curious expressions, some fear, some displayed open disdain. Rarely had the Dothraki welcomed strangers into their midst. But times were changing. In the largest tent, built around the remains of a broken wooden idol, Khal Ortha received Robb as a guest. They sat on woven mats across from each other, while Ortha's closest warriors and wives hovered nearby, casting dispassionate or occasionally suspicious glances at Robb's own guard. A slave boy brought a platter of goat meat and bowls of fermented mare's milk. "Get out." Robb sipped and tried not to wince at the sourness. If he was to court the Dothraki, he would need to show respect for their customs, no matter how strange they tasted. The talks began slowly. At first, Ortho offered only riddles in the form of half-boasting. He talked of the wide grass sea, of future conquests. He bragged that he might lead his Khalasar west someday, if only to test his riders' prowess. Robb listened, weaving compliments about their skill in battle, their famed courage, their unbreakable spirit. He then carefully introduced the notion of mutual gain. He spoke of the riches that lay beyond the narrow sea, of the 7 kingdoms locked in civil war. He conjured images of gold-laden caravans, of defeated enemies, of new lands to explore. Ortho listened, his eyes glimmering with interest whenever Robb mentioned loot and glory. Still, the Khal demanded to know why Robb needed the Dothraki. Could a king not command armies of his own? Robb admitted the truth in part. He had been betrayed in the west, he said, and he had come to Essos to gather new forces. The Dothraki might ride at his side to retake his homeland, and in return, the spoils would flow. When he paused, searching for a reaction, Ortho tilted his head, tapping a calloused finger on his knee. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant whinnying of a horse. Then the Khal gave a short laugh. He would need more than words to join this foreigner's fight, he said. He wanted to see the king in the north prove himself. A test, of course. It was the Dothraki way. Robb inwardly sighed but maintained a stoic front. Ortho demanded that Robb ride with them, on a raid of a nearby city of slavers, for the inhabitants had grown presumptuous in their dealings. If Robb fought well, if he showed the might that had earned him a place in the hearts of his men, then Ortho might consider an alliance. Robb glanced at his men. He could see some were uneasy. Raiding a city, even one of slavers, was not exactly the honorable warfare they had been raised to respect. But they needed the Dothraki, and the Dothraki demanded blood and victory. At dawn the next day, Robb mounted a sturdy Essosi horse, not as tall as a northern warhorse, but quicker, more agile. His men did the same. The ride out of the encampment was a spectacle of dust and thunder, thousands of hooves pounding the earth. As they raced across the grass sea, the wind whipped through Robb's hair. For the first time in a long while, he felt a thrill that was almost akin to joy. There was a freedom in riding like this, with the horizon wide open and the sun climbing overhead. Even in Westeros, he had never galloped in such a vast, boundless expanse. The city they targeted was a minor outpost known for its slave market, perched along a tributary of the Skahzadan. Surrounded by half-ruined walls, it had grown complacent with its moderate wealth, not expecting a swift raid from so far inland. Khal Ortha's riders swept in from 3 sides, their battle cries ringing in the morning light. Robb's men joined from the 4th, charging through a poorly guarded gate. The defenders scrambled. Some were hired swords, others slavers with little discipline. The initial clash was brutal. Horses reared, men screamed. Steel found flesh. Robb, in the thick of it, felt the old grim determination take hold. He brandished his sword, fighting side by side with Northmen and Dothraki alike. He cut down a slaver who tried to flee, then engaged a pair of mercenaries who lunged at him with short spears. His horse sidestepped, and he countered with a swift slash. Blood spattered on his saddle. While the Dothraki took glee in capturing and looting, Robb aimed to fight strategically. He wanted to show Ortho he was more than a savage or a fool. He organized his men to secure the city's gate, preventing an ambush from behind. He directed a few to sabotage the small watchtowers, ensuring no alarm could be raised to summon reinforcements. The entire raid took less than an hour. The city's wealth was not great, but it was enough to lure the horse lords. And crucially, it demonstrated that Robb would stand his ground and fight alongside them, unafraid of blood and dust. Khal Ortho noticed. After the last of the defenders lay dead or surrendered, the Khal approached Robb, smiling in that triumphant, toothy way. He touched a finger to a fresh cut on Robb's upper arm, almost like an elder praising a child's first kill. There was a glimmer of respect in his eyes. He declared that the king in the north had proven himself a warrior. Though Ortho did not kneel, he would never kneel. He acknowledged Robb as a leader worthy to ride with. It was not an oath of fealty, but it was the beginning of an alliance. That evening, they camped outside the ruined city. Fires crackled, and the aroma of roasting meat tangled with the metallic stench of blood. Slaves were freed, or else claimed by the Dothraki, who had no qualms about taking spoils for themselves. Robb tried to urge Ortho to release them, citing the principle that had guided him thus far, but the Khal only laughed. Still, a small number of them drifted to Robb's side, preferring the Northern King's rumored mercy. This caused more than a few uneasy glances among the Khalasar. Some muttered that these foreigners did not honor the true spirit of the Dothraki. Others were curious. Was this man truly as strong as he seemed? Or was he hiding a softness that would be exploited in time? A subtle power play ensued. Robb proposed that if Ortho wanted to raid more cities, they could do so with better strategy, targeting the under-defended outposts, building up momentum, forging an army. He explained that uniting multiple Khalasars would bring greater spoils. The mention of other Khals drew a spark of interest from Ortho. The Dothraki had famously fractious loyalties. Each Khalasar was its own realm, and alliances between them were fleeting. But Robb had learned from the freed Unsullied, and from sellsword captains, that a handful of Khals might be persuaded to join forces if the prize was big enough. The Iron Throne was no minor prize. Ortho shrugged, drinking deeply from a skin of fermented mare's milk. He said if Robb could convince the other Khals to follow, then perhaps they could have a true Khalasar of Khalasars, an unstoppable tide that would sweep across the seas. In the days that followed, Robb and his men rode with Ortho's Khalasar, slowly weaving trust. The Dothraki observed the Northerners' discipline and skill. The Northerners watched the Dothraki's fearsome unity in battle. Through nights of drinking and crude laughter, of shared hunts and the distribution of plunder, a tentative bond formed. Still, tensions sometimes flared. Some of Robb's men objected to how the Dothraki treated captives. Some of the Dothraki objected to the restraint Robb tried to impose. Robb managed each conflict with the same even hand that had once held the northern lords in line. Sometimes it required a stern rebuke, sometimes a small compromise. Above all, he reminded them of the greater goal: the conquest of Westeros and vengeance upon those who had wronged House Stark. That notion, the promise of what lay across the sea, glory, gold, and lands to pillage, kept the Dothraki from fracturing too soon. Their journey across the grass sea was unlike anything Robb had experienced. The grass swayed in shimmering waves beneath an endless vault of sky. There were days when the sun blazed so fiercely that men's lips cracked and their skin darkened. There were nights when the wind howled across the plains, unsettling the horses. But always, they kept moving, setting up camp by shallow rivers or near small clusters of trees. The Dothraki scouted ahead, intercepting caravans, collecting tribute from lesser settlements, capturing stallions to add to their herds. Robb's men rarely saw a day pass without some form of combat or negotiation. Yet, gradually, a sense of routine emerged. Robb felt a new confidence taking root within him, a sense that he was forging his own destiny. No longer the boy who led the North into a war he only half understood. He was now a king of exiles, forging alliances in the dust and heat of Essos. He knew that the path forward was fraught with danger. The Lannisters would not sit idle if rumors of his movements reached them. His own homeland was under the heel of traitors. He had to move carefully, To gather enough strength to cross the narrow sea as a tide unstoppable, he had to find ships to ferry Dothraki. An enormous logistical challenge, given their aversion to water. But that was for tomorrow. For now, he consolidated power with Ortho. After several weeks, word reached them of a warlike Khalasar to the southeast, led by Khal Harrow, rumored to be large enough to challenge Ortha's. Robb listened intently as scouts delivered news that Harrow had seized goods from passing merchants, that he was threatening the surrounding region. To the Dothraki, this was simply their way of life. But Robb saw an opportunity. If he could orchestrate a meeting between Ortho and Harrow, perhaps they could merge under a single cause. Of course, the two Khals might also fight to the death, diminishing their combined potential. But it was a risk he had to take. Ortho agreed to ride toward Harrow's territory, but it was clear he considered it a challenge to his own supremacy. He told Robb that if Harrow would not kneel, they would fight. That was how Dothraki determined their rulers. Robb found his heart beating faster. A direct confrontation could cost too many lives on both sides. If they were to retake Westeros, they needed as many warriors as possible. So he spent nights in Ortha's tent, trying to reason with him, proposing that a show of unity might be more profitable than bloodshed. Ortho listened with the impenetrable calm of a desert snake. Sometimes he would nod. Sometimes he would shrug. It was impossible to read his intentions. But they continued riding south, day after day. On one particularly scorching afternoon, the horizon shimmered like molten silver. Scouts announced that Khal Harrow's outriders had been spotted. Tension crackled like summer lightning. The two Khalasars camped perhaps a league apart, each suspiciously circling the other. At sunset, a meeting was arranged. Robb rode with Ortho to the midpoint between camps, a bare circle of ground amid the tall grass, ringed by a handful of men from each side. Harrow arrived with a retinue of fearsome-looking riders, their arcs glinting in the last rays of dying light. He was older than Ortho, broad-shouldered, with braided hair that reached past his waist. His face bore scars that testified to many battles. He sneered upon seeing Ortho. The two Khals exchanged insults in Dothraki, rattling off each other's defeats or rumored cowardices. Their men scowled, gripping weapons tightly. Robb stood at Ortha's side, measuring Harrow's reaction. Harrow's gaze flicked to Robb with curiosity, then scorn. A foreigner among Dothraki was always a curiosity, but one who wore the mantle of a king was either brave or a fool. The argument escalated, the Dothraki words so rapid that Robb struggled to follow. He heard repeated mentions of foreigner, sea crossing, spoils, and glory. Harrow appeared unconvinced by Ortha's talk of the wonders that might lie across the narrow sea. But then Robb spoke up, trying to address Harrow directly. The older Khal turned to him, eyes narrowing, and demanded to know why he should risk his Khalasar for a Westerosi cause. Robb answered calmly, describing the Seven Kingdoms, speaking of gold in Casterly Rock, of the bustling markets in Old Town, of the riches that might be gleaned from King's Landing. He hinted at the fractious state of Westeros, how they could strike while the realm was divided. He even played on the Dothraki's pride. In centuries past, they had never made the crossing, deterred by the forbidding sea. But what could be more legendary than a Khal who conquered a land across the water? Harrow listened, stroking his braided hair. Then he demanded a personal demonstration of Robb's skill. If this king in the north was truly a warrior worth following, let him stand in single combat and prove it. Ortho glanced at Robb, uncertain. Robb felt a weight in his stomach. Single combat was not a novelty to him, but a challenge from a Dothraki meant the duel would be savage. And he suspected Harrow would want to kill him to make a point. Unless Robb proved unstoppable. But he had no choice. Refusing would be seen as weakness, and Harrow would never join them. So he nodded. There, under the deepening evening sky, a circle formed. Torches were lit, forming a ring of flickering light around a patch of ground worn flat by the tread of many hooves. Harrow selected one of his bloodriders, a towering man named Kuoto, with braided hair to his waist and a torso covered in ritual scars. Robb stood in the center, weapon in hand, heart pounding but his face set with determined calm. Koto snarled in heavily accented common tongue that he would feast on Robb's heart. Robb did not bother replying. He sank into a practiced stance, recalling every lesson from Sir Roderick Castle, every spar he had endured in the yard at Winterfell. The moment Ortho signaled the start, Kuotho exploded forward, Arak whistling through the air. Robb parried the first blow, feeling the shock rattle up his arm. Koto was strong, lightning fast. Robb circled, trying to keep the man from gaining momentum. The Dothraki battled with fluid arcs of slashing steel, designed to hack limbs or heads in swift, unstoppable strikes. Robb had to remain cautious, relying on a more methodical style. Sparks flew as steel struck steel. Koto's footwork was surprisingly nimble, forcing Robb to backstep. The circle of onlookers roared, some cheering for Koto, some for Robb. Ortho watched intently, expression unreadable. Robb found an opening and lunged, slashing across Kuoto's side, opening a gash that darkened his leathers. Koto hissed in pain but pressed on. They exchanged several more blows, until a miscalculation on Robb's part allowed Kuro's Arak to slice a shallow cut along Robb's thigh. Pain flared. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the hot trickle of blood. He had to end this fast. When Kuoto lunged in for a finishing strike, Robb twisted sideways, hooking Kuoto's arm with his own and driving his sword deep into Koto's chest. The Dothraki stared into Robb's eyes with shocked fury. Then his grip slackened, the Arak clattering to the ground. Robb shoved him off his blade. The crowd fell silent, save for the crackle of torches and Koto's labored final breath. Robb, chest heaving, stood victorious. Blood from the leg wound soaked his breeches. He felt a spike of sorrow for the life he had just taken, but he hid it behind a mask of hard-won acceptance. The Dothraki parted as he limped out of the circle, wearing the blood of a fallen foe. Harrow scowled. His pride demanded that he at least acknowledge Robb's victory, but he was far from subservient. Still, he spoke words that implied a grudging respect. He would consider Ortho's plan. Perhaps it was time for a new path. With that, the two Khals parted ways to let their men rest before formal talks continued in the morning. Robb's men quickly found him, helping him limp to a tent where a field medic treated his wounds. The cut on his leg was not life-threatening, but it would slow him for days. Stitched and bandaged, he dozed fitfully, the night's fatigue claiming him. By dawn, the tension had eased slightly. Blood had been shed, an offering to the Dothrakis' savage sense of honor. Robb emerged from his tent stiffly, feeling the ache in his leg, greeting Ortho's men with a curt nod. The Khal met him with an approving grin. Ortho boasted in front of his warriors that the king in the north had the heart of a true stallion, a high compliment among the Dothraki. Harrow arrived with a smaller retinue. He was still not exactly cordial, but he spoke with less hostility. He announced that he would join forces only if he could personally benefit. He wanted gold, slaves, loot, everything that came from a successful invasion. Robb forced himself not to recoil at the mention of slaves. He knew he could not appear weak by objecting too firmly now, but in the back of his mind, he resolved that if he ever sat upon the Iron Throne, or at least reclaimed the North, he would not allow slavery to thrive. That would be a bridge to cross when the time came. For now, Harrow's promise of thousands of Dothraki riders was too great an opportunity to pass up. Ortho, seeing the advantage of having another major Khalasar under his banner, took the lead in forging a tentative pact. Robb stood by, chiming in at key moments to emphasize the grand vision. An unprecedented union of Khalasars crossing the narrow sea to carve out unimaginable glory and riches. The details were hammered out in coarse words and gestures. By the time the sun was high, the two Khals had reached a fragile agreement. They would travel together, uniting their riders under a single command, though which Khal would truly lead seemed open to interpretation. If they succeeded, there would be gold enough for everyone. The reality of who would stand at the top of the pyramid would be decided later. Thus began the next step in Robb Stark's odyssey. As the days turned to weeks, their combined horde swelled as smaller Khalasars joined or were absorbed by the greater power. Some arrived out of curiosity, some out of fear, some out of hunger for the rumored spoils. Robb's own force of Northmen and Essos allies remained comparatively small, but the men realized they were at the heart of something epic. They trained daily, forging new tactics that blended Westerosi discipline with Dothraki ferocity. Robb formed a special cavalry unit, encouraging his men to learn the Dothraki style of riding and archery. In turn, a few Dothraki warriors showed interest in the heavy armor and shield walls used by the Northerners, intrigued by a style of combat that was so alien yet effective. Still, challenges abounded. The Dothraki had no concept of a single king commanding them all. Their alliances were precarious at best, reliant on strength and fear. And there were other powers in Essos that might move against them. Word of a massive Dothraki horde, uniting for some unknown conquest, began to spread, reaching city-states like Volantis, Pentos, and beyond. Sellsword companies weighed whether to oppose or join this unstoppable tide. Spies slipped through the grass, trying to glean the horde's true intent. Robb knew time was short. He needed to secure a fleet capable of transporting thousands of horsemen and their mounts across the sea. A near impossible task under normal circumstances, but perhaps not for a king who had proven unstoppable so far. One quiet evening, Robb walked through the sprawling camp, feeling the springy grass underfoot. The moon was bright, illuminating rows of tents, picketed horses, and flickering cookfires. On the outskirts he found a small hill and climbed it, ignoring the dull throb in his stitched leg. At the top, he gazed out at the endless mass of the Khalasars. Fires dotted the horizon like tiny stars fallen to earth, thousands upon thousands of Dothraki and their animals, forming the backbone of what might be the greatest invasion Westeros had ever seen. Robb felt both awe and apprehension. If he failed to control this tide, if the Dothraki unleashed their full savagery on Westeros, the realm would drown in blood. Yet if he harnessed it, if he channeled their violence against the Lannisters, Boltons and Freys, perhaps he could shatter the hold of those who had stolen his father's name and violated his family. He wondered what his father, Ned Stark, would think of his path now. Would he be horrified? Proud? Or would he simply bow his head in sorrow at the necessity of such brutality? In that moment, the wind whispered across the grass, and Robb closed his eyes. He felt a fierce resolve coil inside him. He was a Stark, and he was not done fighting. If he had to stand at the head of a horde of horse lords, if he had to broker uneasy alliances with blood-stained khals, if he had to make pacts with sellswords and foreign lords, he would do so. He would return to Westeros like the northern winds, cold and unstoppable. He would make the Lannisters pay for the execution of his father, for the harm done to Sansa, for the horrors inflicted on the north. He would tear down the Boltons and the Freys, let them taste the fear that had haunted him since the Red Wedding. And he would do it all with the might of Essos behind him. As he turned to descend the hill, he spotted a figure approaching. It was Edwin Tallheart, the solemn lord who had been at his side since the disastrous wedding. Edwin inclined his head in respect, then asked if Robb was certain about this alliance. The old ways taught them that the Dothraki were barbarians, prone to madness. Could they truly be controlled? Robb was silent for a moment, then admitted he was not sure. But he was sure that House Stark could not regain its honor by half measures. They had tried honor alone, and it had cost them dearly. Now, they must adapt or die. He placed a hand on Tallheart's shoulder, speaking with quiet conviction. They would find a way. That was the only option left. Night pressed on, and the fires burned low. Horses stamped and whinnied as the camp settled. In his own tent, Robb forced himself to rest. Dreams claimed him, swirling with images of Winterfell's snow-dusted towers, of the quiet crypts beneath its halls, of his brothers and sisters scattered like leaves in a storm. He dreamed of the Red Wedding, of crossbow bolts and the shrieks of terror, of Grey Wind's final howl echoing through the cold stone walls. Then he dreamed of the open sea, of a vast fleet bearing the snarling wolf banner, and of Dothraki screamers galloping up the shores of Westeros. He woke before dawn, sweat-drenched and heart-pounding. The scar on his leg ached, as if reminding him that the past was never truly gone. Outside, the sky was turning pale gray. He heard voices passing by, men speaking about the day's duties, a woman scolding her child in a hushed tone, the low murmur of horses. A new day was beginning, another step closer to whatever end awaited them all. Robb rose, dressed, and strapped on his sword belt. This day, he planned to speak with Ortho and Harrow about the next steps. They would need to march east, closer to the coasts, find a city or ports that could be coerced or bribed into building them a fleet. That would require cunning, negotiation, or more likely a show of force. He would also have to keep peace between the two Khals, whose simmering rivalry threatened to erupt at any moment. He rubbed his temples, thinking how great the burden was. But he would bear it. He was the king in the north, even if he stood a continent away from home. So he strode out of the tent, walking slowly, ignoring the pain in his leg, nodding curtly at the men who saluted him. The Dothraki they passed offered only wary stares or grudging acknowledgments, but more than a few nodded in respect, remembering how he had fought side by side with them, how he had slain Koto in single combat. Reputation, Robb realized, was everything to the Dothraki. He had begun to carve one for himself here in this savage land, far from the cold slopes of Winterfell. As the combined Khalasars prepared to move, Robb searched the horizon. The sun was rising, tinted red as it climbed, painting the grasses in shimmering shades of fire. He felt a stirring of hope that he tried to temper with caution. The path ahead was a precarious one, forging alliances with men who might as soon slit his throat as follow him, leading an army that could become uncontrollable at any moment, and re-entering a Westeros that had changed drastically since his departure. But that was the way of kings, to stride willingly into the lion's den, determined to emerge victorious. He cast his gaze toward the men who stood by him, Northmen who had followed him through heartbreak, Essos warriors who had come for coin, freed slaves who saw in him a liberator. Each of them was a thread in a tapestry he was weaving, a tapestry that might reshape the fate of Westeros. As the first lines of the sun peeled away the night, Robb Stark mounted his horse, reined it toward the southeast, and led his growing host onward, deeper into the heart of Essos, toward a destiny that glimmered with both promise and peril. As they pressed eastward, the combined Khalasars stretched over the plains in an almost endless column of riders, wagons, and restless herds. Each morning, Robb rose to find the horizon dotted with clustered groups of Dothraki breaking fast or sharpening their blades, preparing for another day's ride. The earth vibrated beneath so many hooves, turning dust into a haze that lingered in the early light. The air crackled with the unspoken tension of too many proud warriors gathered under a tenuous banner. Yet for all its risks, the sight roused a strange exhilaration in Robb. Such a host could reshape the world if properly led. The next major challenge was logistics. While the Dothraki were used to living off the land, there were thousands of them now, combined from multiple Khalasars. Hunting and foraging could only go so far before the plains were stripped bare. They needed supplies, grain, salted meats, cloth, weapons, and more. Robb, Ortho, and Harrow spent long hours in prickly negotiation, discussing how best to secure provisions without fracturing their unity. Some among the Dothraki claimed the simplest way was to raid any settlement in their path. Others noted that too many raids would alert the great city-states and draw the wrath of larger armies. Robb insisted they approach carefully, mindful that a single disastrous confrontation could scatter their newly forged alliance. Warily, Ortho and Harrow accepted Robb's advice to purchase some supplies from local enclaves, a laughable idea to many Dothraki, who saw no reason to exchange gold for what they could seize by strength. But Robb promised that, by avoiding wanton destruction, they would preserve their numbers and keep the path to the coast free of major enemies. The mention of building ships, thousands of them, eventually lent weight to his argument. They needed more than just fleeting plunder. They needed stable alliances with coastal powers or unscrupulous shipwrights willing to construct a fleet large enough to carry horses across the sea. That would not happen if every potential partner feared a rampaging horde. Their first experiment in restrained cooperation came when they crossed paths with a large caravan traveling under the banner of a powerful Volantene merchant. The caravan, many wagons long, carried spices and textiles destined for the markets near the Jade Sea. Robb halted the horde a league away and, with Hera's grudging permission, approached the caravan with a contingent of his own men and a handful of Dothraki riders. He wished to purchase vital supplies: flour, dried fish, medicinal herbs. When the merchant's guards first caught sight of the approaching cavalry, panic rippled along the line. Men reached for bows, and wagon drivers whipped their mules forward, hoping to flee. But Robb raised an open hand in a gesture of peace, commanding his men to lower their weapons. It was a delicate dance, one that might end in blood if the merchant so much as sensed a trap. Robb dismounted, striding forward with purposeful calm. He introduced himself, employing the formal courtesy of the common tongue. The merchant, perspiring heavily in the heat, eyed Robb's northern gear and the scowling Dothraki at his back. In hesitant Volantene, accented speech, he asked if they meant to pillage. Robb insisted they only wished to trade. It was an improbable claim, but the merchant seemed intrigued by the potential profit. In the distance, Harrow and Ortho kept watch, surrounded by restless riders who muttered that this was a waste of time. Yet neither Khal intervened. The negotiations stretched on under the baking sun. Robb offered coin gleaned from previous conquests and bartered prized weaponry taken from fallen foes. For the Dothraki, this entire exchange was a novelty. Many watched from a distance with open scorn, some spitting in the dust, irritated that a horde of this size would stoop to begging for goods. But when the merchant finally relented, agreeing to sell supplies for a fair sum, there was a shift in the air. Crates of flour, barrels of salted fish, and a variety of dried fruits were brought forth. Robb's men loaded them onto a series of pack animals they had purchased. The merchant, keen to preserve his life, even offered a discount, hoping to placate the Dothraki's infamous temper. When the deal was sealed, Robb thanked the merchant and wished him safe travels. The caravan rumbled away, leaving only a pale cloud of dust in its wake. Robb mounted his horse, glancing back at Harrow and Ortho. Harrow wore the fixed scowl he always seemed to reserve for Robb, but Ortho gave a small nod, grudging admiration for the success of the transaction. They had gained crucial supplies without shedding blood. Perhaps, Robb thought, they were learning something new. A precarious cooperation that could preserve the horde's strength until the right moment came to unleash it. That evening, the camp was in high spirits. Cooking fires flared, and the aroma of fresh bread floated on the breeze. Some of the Dothraki who had scoffed at trading seemed pleased enough with the results, for their bellies would be fuller tonight. Among Robb's closest advisors, there was murmured agreement that if such exchanges could continue, they might sustain the colossal horde during its march to the sea. Robb, for his part, felt relief layered with uncertainty. They had succeeded once. The next caravan, or the next city they approached, might prove far less amenable, or might attempt to set a trap. Still, each day that passed knit the alliance a little tighter. The Dothraki were not a people of treaties and parchment. They were a people of experience, of shared victory or defeat. As long as these new methods worked, they would tolerate them. But if at any point Robb's cautious strategy failed, if an ambush decimated a scouting party, or a rebellious city managed to hold off a raid, the whole structure might crumble. Robb carried that burden quietly, determined not to show doubt. A king, he reminded himself, must exude confidence even when facing the unknown. Before long, they encountered the kind of obstacle Robb dreaded. Word came of a large force gathering to the south, one of the Volantene satraps who controlled swaths of farmland near the coast. The man had heard rumors of a united Dothraki horde, commanded by a foreign king, and was assembling his own army to repel an invasion. Scouts brought conflicting reports of the satrap's numbers, but they agreed it was not a trifling force. The satrap had war elephants and trained foot soldiers, enough to make even the Dothraki cautious. Ortho and Harrow quickly spoke of attacking first, of scattering the satrap's forces before they could organize. Robb argued that a pitched battle might be too risky, especially given the possibility of the satrap forging alliances with other city-states. But The Khals despised the notion of skirting a fight. They wanted blood and glory. In the end, they agreed on a compromise. They would approach the satrap's territory swiftly, but not blindly. Robb sent out riders to gather more detailed intelligence on the satrap positions, an uncharacteristic tactic for the Dothraki, who usually relied on raw, unstoppable speed. The scouts soon discovered that the satrap was deploying battalions along the main thoroughfares, hoping to catch the horde in a bottleneck. Robb proposed a maneuver to circle around, using an old caravan route that skirted a line of steep hills. Ortho grumbled that it would mean a slower pace, that the men were hungry for a real fight. Harrow spat in the dust, accusing Robb of cowardice. But when Robb pointed to the strategic value of flanking the satrap's lines and cutting off supply routes, the Khals seemed intrigued. The promise of catching their enemy off guard soothed their pride. So they steered the horde southeast, away from the heavily guarded roads. Trusting Robb's plan, the journey proved arduous. The old route was narrow, winding along rocky slopes. The horde had to travel in smaller columns, the horses sometimes slipping on loose shale. Morale dipped as the days wore on without the usual freedom to gallop or raid. But they pressed on, urged by Robb's unwavering insistence that their patience would be rewarded. Then at last, their scouts returned with news. The satrap had stationed the bulk of his forces near a fortified town that guarded a primary pass, leaving the flanks underdefended. That night, around a ring of low-burning campfires, Robb laid out a plan. He would lead a swift strike with Ortha's most experienced riders, hitting the satrap outlying detachments at dawn. Simultaneously, Harrow's Khalasar would sweep in from the opposite direction. So in confusion, the satrap's main force, believing the threat to come from the pass, would be forced to react to multiple assaults at once. If executed properly, they could rout the defenders quickly. Many Dothraki warriors listened intently, excitement building in their eyes. Harrow, still somewhat suspicious of any plan that was not his own, kept his face impassive, yet there was a gleam in his gaze, a thirst for battle that made him momentarily receptive to Robb's leadership. Before dawn, the Dothraki column split as planned. Robb rode at Ortha's side, ignoring the dull ache in his stitched leg, now half-healed. The rush of adrenaline sharpened him. Light gradually broke the eastern sky, painting the horizon in the faintest shades of purple and pink. The makeshift route they'd chosen opened onto a rolling plain where the satrap's outer watch had built meager fortifications, a handful of wooden stakes, some shallow trenches, not nearly enough to stop thousands of galloping riders. At Ortha's signal, they broke into a pounding charge. The morning air thundered with hooves. Robb's heart hammered, memories of past battles flooding him, from the battlefields of the Westerlands to the chaotic ambushes near the Twins. Only this time the cavalry beneath him was monstrous, a wave that could smash anything in its path. The sentries scrambled. Arrows whistled, and a handful of riders fell, but the Dothraki slammed through the defenses in moments. The defenders panicked, some dropping weapons to flee, others forming a disorganized line. Robb led a flanking maneuver, cutting off escape. Ortha's men crashed into the satrap's ranks from the front, slicing through them like a scythe through tall grass. Dust and screams filled the air. The satrap's foot soldiers tried to regroup around a pair of elephants, but before they could mount a proper counterattack, Harrow's Khalasars swept in from the rear, driving them into chaos. Trumpeting in alarm, one of the elephants bolted, trampling defenders and clearing a path for the Dothraki to surge deeper into the lines. Robb felt the jolt of steel against steel, the weight of adrenaline coursing through him. He shouted orders, rallying the men around a cluster of enemy soldiers who seemed on the verge of forming a shield wall. With precise discipline, Robb's men broke their formation, though not without cost. He saw two of his loyal northerners fall to short spears, their faces twisted in pain. He pressed on, sword glinting in the sun, determined to end the threat swiftly. Through the swirling dust, he glimpsed Ortho in the thick of it, braids flying, Arak drenched in blood. On the opposite flank, Harrow unleashed his personal guard, cutting down archers who tried to make a stand near a ruined watchtower. The slaughter was fierce but relatively brief. Overwhelmed by the unexpected two-pronged assault, the satrap's forces broke, retreating in disarray toward the town they had intended to defend. Many were cut down in pursuit, others surrendered, throwing themselves on the ground, arms raised. The elephants were captured or slain. When the dust settled, the Dothraki whooped in triumph, brandishing weapons and calling out to the sky. Robb felt a grim satisfaction. The victory had been swift, and though he regretted the bloodshed, it had showcased the power of their combined host. If the Horde could break a disciplined army with minimal losses, the path to the coast might indeed be open. Yet the battle was not entirely won. The satrap himself still held the fortified town beyond the fields, and Harrow insisted they press forward, taking it at once. Robb cautioned them that the walls were sturdy, and the defenders might have reserves inside. Storming the gates under a hail of arrows would be costly. Ortho, flushed with victory, sneered at the idea of caution, while Harrow, his blood up, threatened to do it himself. Robb sensed the old fault lines re-emerging. The Dothraki, in their triumph, saw no reason to hesitate. They did not fear casualties the way Westerosi knights did, for they believed battle was the purest expression of strength. To maintain cohesion, Robb grudgingly agreed to strike, while momentum was on their side. But he also proposed a ruse. Half of the combined Khalasars would mount a display on one side of the town, feigning a direct assault, while Robb's men and the remainder circled to the rear, seeking a weaker point in the defenses. Harrow gave a savage grin, pleased by the prospect of a fight from two fronts. Ortho seemed equally eager. They set off at a gallop, closing the distance to the town, whose ramparts bristled with anxious soldiers, many of them likely survivors of the earlier rout. The defenders scrambled, flinging open crates of arrows, setting torches to pitch-filled braziers atop the battlements. Without further delay, Ortho's riders launched themselves at the gates, howling fearsome battle cries. Arrows rained down, striking horses and men. Bodies fell, the wounded screaming as the wave of cavalry slammed the sturdy gate. Robb's heart clenched. He urged his own detachment around to the far side, seeking that rumored patch of crumbling stone wall. If they could breach it quickly, the defenders would be caught between two surging forces. Robb's men found it at last, an old bastion where the mortar had cracked, leaving gaping fissures. He ordered the Dothraki archers who rode with him to fire at the top of the wall, keeping the defenders occupied. Meanwhile, a group of Robb's Northmen and freed pit fighters from Meereen rushed in with picks and hammers, striking the weakened stone. Robb dismounted to help, ignoring the throbbing ache in his leg. Stone fragments tumbled away, dust filling the air. Within minutes, a section of wall gave way in a thunderous crash, leaving a gap large enough for men to scramble through. A surge of Dothraki riders poured in, followed by Robb's men. Inside the town, narrow streets and alleys forced them to dismount or risk being pinned. Fighting erupted in every direction, echoing off stone walls. The defenders, though shaken, still fought fiercely. Robb ducked under a swinging sword, driving his own blade up into a soldier's ribs. Another came at him with a spear, which he deflected with the battered remains of his shield. He felt a burning pain in his side when the man's second thrust slipped past his guard, but he managed to twist away. He countered with a slash that opened the man's neck. Blood spattered across the cobblestones. The coppery tang of it clung to the back of Robb's throat. Somewhere near the main gate, the thunder of hooves signaled Ortho's riders breaking through. Robb could almost feel the quake of the gate collapsing under repeated strikes. Shouts and cries echoed among the narrow lanes, the defenders trapped in a lethal pincer. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, cowered in doorways. Robb ordered his men to spare non-combatants where possible, but many Dothraki gave no heed. His allies from the north tried to herd panicked townsfolk away, but chaos reigned. Flames burst from a row of wooden buildings, ignited by errant torches or knocked over braziers. Within an hour, the defenders surrendered en masse, laying down their arms in the central square, kneeling before the unstoppable might of the Horde. As the dust of battle settled, Ortho and Harrow took stock of their hard-won conquest. The satrap was found in a fortified manor, cowering behind his last few guards. Harrow personally dragged the man out into the square, forcing him to kneel in humiliation. A ring of triumphant Dothraki closed in, chanting for blood. Robb stepped forward, uncertain how to handle the situation. He had no particular love for the satrap, who had tried to kill them, but he also didn't savor the idea of a public execution, with no chance for negotiation. Ortho, smelling the satrap's fear, demanded he pledge fealty to the new horde or die. The trembling man stammered that he would do anything to live. Harrow laughed, claiming that one such as this would betray them at the first opportunity. Robb asked for a moment to think, but Ortho had no interest in waiting. With a casual flick of his wrist, he ran his arak across the satrap's throat, sending a crimson arc spraying onto the cobblestones. The satrap toppled forward, lifeless. Robb tensed, stifling a surge of anger. There had been a chance to glean resources, to gain a local puppet who might secure their passage. Ortho had snuffed that possibility on a whim. Harrow, though, chuckled in approval. The onlookers roared their praise. To them, a swift display of dominance was the only language worth speaking. Robb bit back his frustration. He reminded himself that these were the allies he had chosen. If he wanted their strength, he would have to accept their savage codes. For now, he let the moment pass without protest, noting how his men from the north avoided meeting his eyes, their expressions troubled. Talhart, who lingered in the back, wore a grim mask that betrayed his unease. They had come a long way from Winterfell, from the ideals of honorable war. Robb exhaled slowly, telling himself that once he reclaimed the north, he might restore the values that House Stark had always cherished. For now, survival and victory demanded a different path. In the aftermath of the conquest, the Dothraki ransacked the town. They gathered what spoils they could. Coin, weapons, exotic goods. Some citizens were allowed to live in servitude, though Robb tried to set free those who chose to join his faction. A handful of skilled blacksmiths and carpenters came forward, preferring to work for this foreign king rather than face the pillaging brutality of the Khalasars. Robb questioned them at length about the region, learning that ships were often built or repaired at a distant port to the east. A place called Selhorys on the Sea, though it was smaller than famed Volantis. It might be a starting point, somewhere to secure a handful of vessels. Over the next few days, the horde occupied the area, recovering from the battle and tending to the wounded. Robb oversaw the distribution of supplies, ensuring his men and the Dothraki had enough to eat. The farmland around the town yielded decent grain. He arranged for the newly acquired blacksmiths to fashion horseshoes and basic arms. The townspeople who remained regarded him with a mixture of fear and awe. Tales spread of the foreign king who had united the great Khalasars. Some whispered he was touched by the old gods, or by the Lord of Light, or by some new force that promised unstoppable conquest. At times, Robb walked the rubble-strewn streets, surveying the damage. Smoke still rose from charred buildings. Bodies had been piled outside the gates for burning. The aftermath of war always left him hollow. He had lost count of how many times he'd stood in a ruined settlement, listening to the quiet sobs of survivors. He thought of his father's teachings: mercy tempered by justice, strength used to protect the weak. Yet here he was, allied with men who took what they wanted, who slit throats without hesitation. It was a bargain he had struck in blood, and he felt the weight of it pressing on him as surely as a physical burden. On the fourth day after the battle, the Khals declared they would move on. Ortho and Harrow planned to head east in search of more conquests, but now they looked to Robb for direction. They had tasted the benefits of his strategies and the wealth that followed. The question was how to proceed. Robb summoned his advisors, Talhart, the ex-pit fighters from Marine, a smattering of Northmen, and together they sat in a commandeered courtyard, poring over a rough map. They debated whether to march straight for Selhorys on the Sea, risking confrontation with any fleets moored there, or to skirt south, closer to more populated regions. Harrow urged an immediate strike on any city, with enough ships to carry them across the sea. Ortho half agreed, but warned that if the city was heavily defended, they could lose many warriors in the assault. Robb calmly explained the concept of siege warfare, something the Dothraki had little patience for. He pointed out that to besiege a city, one needed to invest time and resources, to starve the defenders out or systematically breach the walls. The Dothraki snorted at the notion of waiting weeks or months. But Robb reminded them how quickly they had taken the last town by employing cunning rather than a headlong charge. After a tense silence, Ortho and Harrow grudgingly nodded, acknowledging there might be value in cunning once more. Thus, they set their sights on Khalasars on the sea, a comparatively modest but strategic port. If it fell without excessive bloodshed, they could secure a base for shipbuilding. From there, the horde could fan out along the coastline, capturing or intimidating other port towns, forging a patchwork supply line. It was an ambitious plan. Robb knew that once they drew near the coast, powers far larger than the satrap's realm would take notice. They might face a coalition of city-states. Sellsword companies would be hired to stand against them. But the horde was immense, and each victory brought more wealth, which in turn could buy more loyalty. When they finally broke camp, thousands of riders poured from the ruined town, spreading across the plains in a dazzling display of motion and might. Robb rode at the forefront, flanked by Ortho and Harrow. Behind them, the combined mass of warriors, pack animals, wagons, and liberated or captured craftspeople stretched out for miles. The sun glinted off polished araks and battered armor, a river of life, flowing east. As they rode, Robb found a moment's peace in the vastness, the steady thud of hooves. He thought of the cool breeze that once swept through Winterfell's courtyard, the snow that blanketed the silent godswood. He whispered a promise to the memory of his father, that he would return, that he would see the Bolton flayed man torn down from the walls of the north, that he would avenge the murders of his kin. Days turned into weeks. Their pace sometimes slowed, especially when they needed to secure more provisions. Minor skirmishes flared with roving bands of brigands or local lords who tried to block their path. But each time, the horde brushed aside resistance. A sense of invincibility pervaded the Dothraki ranks, feeding their pride and hunger. Robb tried to maintain discipline among his Northmen, ensuring they did not become lost in a frenzy of looting. He suspected that eventually, he would have to rein in Ortho and Harrow more forcefully. But for now, their alliance held. At dusk one evening, they reached a vantage point high on a ridge, overlooking the final stretch to Khalasars on the sea. The grasslands fell away to gently sloping terrain dotted with olive groves and farmland. Beyond that, a glimmer of water flickered in the fading light. Robb felt his pulse quicken at the sight of the sea. It was not the cold, windswept coastline of the north, but it was water nonetheless, an ocean path leading back to Westeros. The promise of home, of vengeance and reclamation, lay across that vast expanse. Now the real work would begin. Subduing a port that might not welcome them, forging or forcing a partnership with those who could build and man enough ships to transport an army unlike anything Westeros had ever seen. As twilight deepened, the horde made camp. Fires were lit, tents raised. Robb gathered Talhart and a few trusted souls to discuss their approach. Should they attempt another negotiation, offering gold in exchange for cooperation? Or should they strike fear into the hearts of Khalasars by parading the might of the horde before the gates? Opinions varied. Talhart believed that they should try diplomacy first, if only to save time and avoid a prolonged siege. Several Northmen agreed, recalling how messy the last battle had been. But some among the ex-pit fighters and Sellswords favored a more direct approach. Conquer the port quickly, then set the shipwrights to work at sword point. Robb found himself torn. He recalled how well negotiation had served them with that earlier caravan, but also how quickly conflict had emerged when facing the Volantene satrap. The city might open its gates if threatened with destruction, but it might also stand firm behind high walls and harbor cunning defenders who could outlast a horde unaccustomed to sieges. In the end, he decided to propose a dual strategy to the Khals. They would send an emissary, a small group under a flag of truce, to gauge the city's readiness and its defenses. If the city seemed malleable, they might avoid bloodshed. If not, the full might of the horde would fall upon them. When he presented this plan to Ortho and Harrow, the Khals exchanged skeptical glances. They had grown accustomed to conquering by sheer force, but they also recognized Robb's cunning had repeatedly spared them from heavy losses. Harrow shrugged, jesting that if the city refused, it would be amusing to burn it from end to end. Ortho smirked, swirling a cup of strong drink. He liked the idea of striding up to the gates to see how quickly the city's rulers might panic. With that tenuous agreement, they prepared to send a mission forward at dawn. Robb chose his emissaries carefully. 2 Northmen who spoke the common tongue and enough of the local dialect to be understood, plus a pair of Dothraki riders to show the alliance's face, and a freed scribe from Meereen who could translate if needed. He instructed them to approach the city gates calmly, declare they came on behalf of the king in the north and the united Khals, and request a parley with the city's leaders. To underscore the seriousness of their message, each man wore a piece of captured armor taken from the satrap's fallen forces, proof that they had bested a Volentine noble. Then Robb watched them ride off under a makeshift white banner, the dawn light coloring the sky in shades of rose and amber. He spent that day in anxious waiting, patrolling the outskirts of the camp, ensuring the men remained disciplined. Rumors spread through the Khalasar like wildfire. Some claimed Selharis had a fortress guarded by monstrous creatures from the Summer Isles. Others said the city was brimming with wealth, ripe for looting. Excitement mingled with apprehension. The day stretched on, hot and stifling, with the smell of horse sweat thick in the air. Finally, late in the afternoon, the emissaries returned. They described the city as well fortified, perched beside an inlet with a modest harbor. The walls were tall but not insurmountable, and the defenders did not seem numerous enough to withstand a lengthy siege. The city elders had listened to the proposal with guarded interest. They had agreed to consider a meeting within Selharis, but they insisted on strict conditions. Only the king in the north and a small escort would be allowed inside. No more than a dozen riders, unarmored, would be permitted to pass the gates. If the horde approached in force, the gates would be barred, and the city would fight. Ortho and Harrow reacted with immediate anger. Harrow scoffed at the insult, calling for an assault. Ortho demanded they tear down the walls as they had done elsewhere. Robb held up a hand, urging patience. He argued that the city's offer of parley indicated fear, which meant they might be open to a deal. The Dothraki did not care for deals, but they cared for spoils. If by some chance, through negotiation, they could secure the city's surrender and the services of its shipwrights without the cost of a siege, they would gain more with fewer losses. After heated debate, the Khals grudgingly allowed Robb to accept the city's terms. It was dangerous, stepping inside with so few men, effectively at the mercy of strangers. But Robb believed that success here would set the stage for the invasion of Westeros. They needed ships. They needed them soon. Risk was unavoidable. So at dusk, Robb selected 11 companions for the mission, including Talhart, a pair of fierce Dothraki who commanded respect, the freed scribe, and a few of his best fighters from the north. Each man wore light armor concealed beneath flowing cloaks, enough to offer some protection without flaunting a breach of the city's restrictions. By the time they reached Selharis, night was settling over the sea. Torches lined the walls, and from within the city, faint lamps glowed like scattered fireflies. At the gate, they were met by a delegation of guards, and a man who introduced himself as the first elder. He was short, balding, dressed in modest but fine clothing. His face shone with sweat in the torchlight. With a trembling voice, he welcomed Robb and his companions, beckoning them to follow. The gates creaked shut behind them. Robb glanced at the closed iron portcullis, reminding himself there would be no easy escape if things turned sour. They were led through winding streets, the architecture, a blend of Eastern and Rhoynish styles, with narrow alleys and arched doorways. The townspeople peered from shuttered windows, fear evident in their eyes. A hush lay over Selharis, as if the entire population held its breath. Eventually, they arrived at a central courtyard ringed by tall pillars, illuminated by braziers. Waiting there were several more elders and a contingent of soldiers armed with spears and crossbows. The tension was palpable. The first elder introduced the others, a burly harbor master, a priest of some local deity, and 3 merchants whose wagons apparently powered much of the city's trade. With cautious politeness, they invited Robb and his men to sit on wooden benches arranged in a semicircle. Robb noted the guards stationed on the periphery, crossbows trained on them. A single misstep would be lethal. He glanced at Talhart, who kept a hand near the hilt of his blade beneath his cloak. The Dothraki at Robb's side exuded a quiet menace, scanning the courtyard for any sign of betrayal. Robb wasted no time explaining who he was. The king in the north uniting the great Khalasars to conquer the sea and cross to Westeros. His purpose in Selharis, he said, was to secure the construction or acquisition of ships. He made no pretense about the city's peril, stating plainly that if they refused, the horde would come. There would be blood, chaos, ruin. But if they cooperated, if they built or sold him vessels, provided a safe harbor, the city might prosper. The elders listened with varying expressions of shock, dread, and calculation. A hush fell when Robb finished speaking. The priest spoke first, trembling, decrying the violence the horde brought. The harbor master, though, asked about payment. If the city risked the wrath of nearby powers by aiding such a horde, they would need substantial compensation. Robb had prepared for this. He mentioned the gold and spoils they had already gathered. He also hinted at future trade opportunities once Westeros was claimed and stabilized. The mention of gold made the merchants lean forward, curiosity shining in their eyes. Perhaps they were not as resolved to fight as their spears suggested. But the question hung in the air. Could they trust the word of a barbarian army's king? And could the horde itself be reined in once the city gates were opened? One of the merchants voiced exactly that concern. Robb replied that the horde was under his command, and that any acts of plunder against Selharis would be punished. He tried to project confidence, though inside he knew Harrow and Ortha's unpredictability could jeopardize everything. Still, the fear of total annihilation might be stronger than the fear of broken promises. The hours wore on in tense discussion. Terms were proposed and revised. Selharis would allow a limited number of Dothraki inside to oversee ship construction, but no more than a few hundred at any time. The city would receive payment in gold and safe passage from any future conquests. In return, the horde would protect Selharis from raiders or rival city-states. Robb expressed willingness, though he knew forging a real alliance would require the approval of the Khals, who rarely tolerated restrictions. At the final hour of negotiation, a sudden uproar at the courtyard's edge broke the fragile calm. A group of city guards came pushing through, dragging a wounded young man who wore a ragged traveler's cloak. His face was smeared with blood, and his eyes darted wildly. The guards claimed he had slipped over the walls, babbling about the horde and some secret message. Robb tensed, uncertain if this was a trap. The elders barked at the intruder to remain silent, but the young man locked eyes with Robb. He spoke in broken common tongue, gasping about another army mobilizing to the south, an alliance of local satraps and city militias who aimed to crush the united Khalasars before they could seize the coast. He claimed he had overheard their war plans in a roadside tavern. Now they marched with a force bigger than anything they had faced. Murmurs and exclamations rippled through the courtyard. Robb's pulse quickened. If this was true, their window of opportunity to take Selharis without a fight might close. The elders looked at one another, suddenly aware that the city sat between two powerful threats. Robb considered the weight of this news. If an alliance of Essos lords truly advanced upon them, he would need Selharis' cooperation more than ever, either to defend it as a strategic harbor or to find a quicker route to escape by sea. The uneasy hush lingered as everyone digested what they had learned. At last, the harbor master spoke. If the horde could truly shield Selharis from this threat, then perhaps they could finalize terms. The city would not survive alone against a massive Essos alliance. Better to ally with the unstoppable wave than be crushed by it. Robb, seizing the momentum, declared that if Selharis became his staging ground, he would protect it as fiercely as he would Winterfell. But for that to happen, the city must open its gates and begin building or acquiring ships immediately. The elders conferred in low, urgent tones, their features cast in the flickering firelight. At length, they consented, albeit with expressions that betrayed deep fear. In the early hours before dawn, both sides affixed seals to a hastily drawn pact, and the gates of Selharis creaked open to receive a small contingent of the horde, carefully limited in number. Robb and his companions rode back to the ridge, escorted by a handful of the city's guards. When they emerged into the camp, they found Ortho and Harrow waiting, surrounded by restless warriors who stirred at the sight of them. The Khals demanded news, bristling with impatience. Robb explained the pact, glancing from one khal to the other, ensuring he maintained calm authority. Ortho spat on the ground, complaining about the limited numbers allowed in the city. Harrow scowled at the notion of paying gold rather than taking, but Robb reminded them of the rumor. A grand army might be marching toward them, and they needed a secure foothold on the coast to stand a chance of holding their ground or escaping if the tide turned. After a tense silence, the khals nodded, conceding the necessity. The promise of ships and fresh spoils placated them for now. They cared little for the city's conditions so long as they could roam outside the walls, continuing to raid the surrounding region for resources. And so, as dawn spread its first pale light across the plains, a new phase of their campaign began. Dothraki parties streamed down to Selhorys, stationed themselves near the gates, and watched warily as city dwellers carried out timbers, nails, and tar to begin constructing makeshift shipyards along the shoreline. The entire settlement was a hive of anxious activity, the buzz of saws and hammers mingling with the steady rumble of so many hooves. Robb spent his days riding between the city and the camp, mediating disputes, ensuring the builders remained safe from overzealous Dothraki who might try to seize them as slaves. He also scouted the southern approaches, posting outriders to watch for any sign of the approaching coalition. The stress piled upon him like stones. Each day brought new challenges: a group of Harrow's men harassing the local blacksmiths, Ortha's riders clashing with city guards over perceived insults, accusations of sabotage when a row of timbers collapsed unexpectedly. Robb resolved each crisis one at a time, aided by Tallheart's quiet steadiness and the insight of the freed scribe who could communicate with locals in half a dozen dialects. Slowly, the skeletons of ships began to rise along the docks, and existing vessels were commandeered or retrofitted to accommodate horses. It was a sight that stirred the hearts of the Northmen, who remembered rumors of ancient Targaryen conquests, the doom of Valyria, the crossing of seas by would-be kings. The Dothraki eyed the rising masts with suspicion and fascination. Some ventured onto the dockboards, testing the sway of the water beneath them, muttering that this was poison to horses. Others watched from a safe distance, content to let foreigners handle the mysteries of the sea. One night, Robb stood on the beach, where the gentle surf lapped at the dark sand. The moon was high, shimmering on the waves. Near him, half-built hulls and stacked lumber formed ghostly silhouettes in the silver light. He heard the distant whinny of horses, the chanting of Dothraki a little farther inland. He closed his eyes, letting the salt-tinged breeze brush his face. For a moment, he imagined the day when these ships, hundreds, maybe thousands, would sail west, carrying the might of Essos toward the shores of Westeros. He allowed himself a flicker of hope, to see Winterfell restored, to free the North from Bolton tyranny, to overthrow the Lannisters who had crushed his family. He pictured the open sea, a horizon unbroken by land, the roar of waves as the wind filled the sails. He pictured the North once more, the thick snow in the Wolfswood, the quiet hush of pine needles underfoot, the stone towers of Winterfell. And beyond that he pictured the Iron Throne. He had never seen it, but he had heard tell of its twisted swords and sharp edges. He thought of Ned Stark's memory, the man who had died an honorable death in a dishonorable world. Robb wondered if he would have recognized his son now, a commander of Dothraki hordes, forging pacts with Essosi city-states, practicing cunning that sometimes verged on ruthlessness. But the time for doubt was gone. He had chosen this course. He would see it through. When he opened his eyes, he found Ortho standing nearby, staring out at the moonlit sea. The Khal's expression was unreadable, half hidden by the shifting shadows. Robb greeted him with a nod. Ortho was silent for a moment. Then he asked in halting common tongue whether Robb truly believed the great stallion, by which he referred to their god, would bless this crossing. Robb answered that he could not speak for the gods, but that the crossing itself would be a legend to rival anything in living memory. The Dothraki had long whispered of the poisoned water, refusing to cross. Yet now, here they were, building the means to do so. Ortho gave a thoughtful grunt, then turned on his heel and headed back inland, braids swaying like restless serpents. In the following weeks, the city's forges clanged day and night, forging nails and fittings, repairing old vessels dragged from the harbor's outskirts. The stench of pitch and tar stained the air. Dothraki outriders roamed the countryside, returning with stolen livestock and captured peasants, which occasionally sparked conflict with the city if they ventured too close. Robb worked tirelessly to keep the fragile alliance from collapsing. It was like balancing on a rope stretched between two cliffs. One misstep and all the progress would plunge into chaos. Every dawn, he rose with a weight in his chest, anticipating new crises. Every dusk, he collapsed into what rest he could manage, half expecting to be awoken by the alarm of an attack or riot. Then, at last, came the news they had dreaded. Scouts raced back from the southern plains, breathless and pale. They spoke of a vast host marching under the banners of multiple Essos lords, Volantine tigers, the golden hawk of an eastern prince, and a half-dozen sigils unknown to them. The combined army was rumored to be tens of thousands strong, with war elephants, sellsword companies, and even rumored war galleys that might strike from the coast. They were weeks away, but advancing steadily, determined to crush the barbarian threat before it could take root. Panic spread through Selhoris. Some citizens whispered that the city would be sacked by whichever side proved stronger. Others begged Robb to defend them. The Dothraki responded with savage glee, delighted at the thought of a monumental battle. In urgent council, Robb gathered Harrow, Ortho, Talhart, and the elders of Selhoris. A dozen ship hulls were under construction, but it would take months to build enough for the entire horde. They had some smaller vessels ready, but nowhere near sufficient capacity to ferry thousands of horses. If the approaching army arrived soon, the city would become a battlefield, and the half-built ships could be torched. Robb's instinct screamed that they could not face a fully prepared, multi-lord alliance head-on, not with the logistical challenges of so many Dothraki in one place. Yet Ortho and Harrow rumbled with impatience, insisting the horde was unstoppable. Selhoris elders, white-faced and shaking, feared total ruin. Robb paced before them, weighing options. They could abandon Selhoris, destroying its shipyards to prevent pursuit, but that would lose them their foothold on the coast, setting their invasion plans back immeasurably. They could attempt a pitched battle, risking the outcome, or they could meet the southern force before it reached the city, using the open plains to their advantage. That last option seemed most in line with Dothraki strengths: mobility, cavalry charges, swift flanking. If they prepared ambushes and used the geography as they had before, they might break the alliance's spirit. Harrow's eyes gleamed at the suggestion. Ortho seemed equally intrigued, but it meant leaving the city's defenses in the hands of a skeleton force, hoping no betrayal occurred in their absence. The elders promised to remain loyal for fear of the horde's return. Robb recognized the gamble, but the alternatives were worse. Thus, he and the Khals decided they would ride south with the bulk of their cavalry, intercept the alliance in a carefully chosen killing ground, and scatter them. Only then would they return to Selhoris to resume building ships unopposed. Swiftly, plans were laid. The Dothraki, who had grown restless in the city's shadow, welcomed the news like a benediction. They yearned for an open field battle, not the tedium of watching ships take shape. Robb arranged to leave a garrison of his Northmen and a handful of Dothraki behind, just enough to keep Selhoris in check, maintain the order needed for shipbuilding, and guard their newly gathered supplies. The city's elders swallowed their anxiety and agreed to house the garrison peacefully, so long as no widespread plundering occurred. 2 days later, the camp outside Selhoris was a flurry of last-minute preparations. Horses were shod, weapons sharpened, scouts briefed on the routes. Robb stood with Talhart at the edge of the bustling scene, surveying thousands of Dothraki mounting up. The clang of metal and the snorting of horses filled the air. Talhart asked if Robb truly believed they could win. Robb admitted they had to. There was no turning back from this path. If the Alliance crushed them here, the dream of returning to Westeros with an army would die. If they won, however, nothing in Essos would stand in their way. Then the horns sounded, low and resonant, echoing across the plains. Harrow and Ortho led the vanguard, galloping eastward in a thunderous cloud of dust. Robb followed, riding alongside a detachment of Northmen and freed fighters, the direwolf banner snapping in the wind. Selhurries dwindled behind them, its newly raised masts like jagged spikes against the sky. Ahead lay the open expanse, the unknown. The horde spread out in a grand crescent, shimmering under the merciless sun. Robb felt the pounding of his heart match the rhythm of hooves. This was the moment that would decide the fate of his grand design. Forging a Dothraki empire across the sea. Reclaiming a lost throne. Avenging the North. Dust billowed around them, swallowing them in the rush of their own momentum. As they hurtled toward the horizon, Robb could almost taste the iron tang of the battle that awaited. Far in the distance, the banners of the Essos lords might already be taking shape. The wind whistled past, carrying the faint echoes of possibility. Victory, defeat, the rending cry of triumph, the wail of heartbreak. He knew only one thing for certain: the die was cast. There would be no easy turning back from the collision that loomed. So the host rode on, stirred by the force of their collective will. They were a savage tide, ready to confront whatever the southern lords mustered. And at their head, Robb Stark, the king in the north, pressed forward with the memory of his homeland burning in his chest. He would see this fight through to whatever end, and if the gods had any sense of justice, it would lead him one step closer to the day when he set foot on Westerosi soil once more. Direwolf banners flying, and the sweet promise of retribution within his grasp.